Hello, everyone, and welcome once again to the Temple Institute Parsha class. My name is Gedalia Meyer, and I'm podcasting from Ma'ale Adumim in Israel. We are all familiar with the concept of superstition. It is generally used as a derogatory term to refer to any practice or belief that has no logical or rational basis. Thus, it is superstition to not walk under a ladder for fear of some danger, or to believe that wearing a rabbit's foot brings good luck. Most religious practices would be labeled superstition by this standard. They rarely are backed by any rational logic and are only accepted by virtue of religious authority or tradition. Of course, it is frequently difficult to know where to draw the line on this standard. Is the effectiveness of a placebo based on superstition? What about the feeling of dread upon entering a certain place or embarking on a certain task? If we insist on an absolutely strict rational basis for everything we do, anything along these lines should be called superstitious. But we all know that the human mind doesn't work this way. We are not computers, no matter how much we try to convince ourselves that we are. Our lives revolve around emotional feelings that have little to no connection to rational thought. Perhaps some AI network could be made to work without any reliance on non-rational leanings, but that only proves that AI is not really human at all. It is in vogue to think that the steady march of humanity towards the modern era has been defined by its willingness to abandon superstition in favor of logic. There is a quite strong basis for believing such an idea. Science in particular has been at the forefront of the battle against superstition. Anything scientific is by definition anti-superstition. It explains the workings of the world as a result of the known laws of nature that follow specific guidelines, and not by the haphazard whims of some feeling or some old belief. But this steady march towards rational progress, as great as it has been, has its casualties. Many people are repulsed by the idea that everything works according to some mechanical system that allows no room for human emotion or mystery. These people want the possibility that things don't always have to run according to some strict scientific plan. They do not wish to see life and all of its intricacies as nothing more than a grand computer program. If this allows others to call them superstitious, then so be it. At least they are still human. It happens that most of the beliefs of the past would be called superstitious today. This is because much of what was believed in the past had no relation to what we now call science. Does this make all of that life in the past nothing more than a long string of incorrect nonsense? Perhaps it does, and the science-minded among us might have no problem saying that everything that happened before our current state of enlightenment was nothing more than hopeless stabs in the dark. But who knows what future generations will think of the current state of knowledge? They might regard us as just as hopelessly lost as we regard those who lived before us. Perhaps it's best if we learn to recognize that human beliefs and human knowledge are always in a state of flux, and one person's superstition is another person's faith and inspiration. It happens that the Bible is a classic example of an ancient collection of beliefs that many today would have no problem labeling superstitious. There are all kinds of animal sacrifices for every imaginable occasion, none of which make any sense today. There is a talking snake and a talking donkey, to say nothing of a bush that burns and is not consumed. God speaks regularly to people, and they either listen or ignore what God has to say. All of this is steeped with antiquated notions of how things work and what forces there are that make things happen. The very notion of God is frequently deemed nothing more than superstition by much of the enlightened world. But again, by regarding anything we cannot see or measure with some gadget as non-existent, we run the risk of burying our humanity in a heap of logic. Is this really what we want? This week's Parsha is called Acharei Mot. That is a two-word phrase which means after the death. Although it sounds a bit ominous, it is really nothing more than an introduction to a certain ceremony that involved the Kohen Gadol, or high priest, who was none other than Aaron, the brother of Moshe. A few parshas ago, two of his sons were tragically burned to death by some sort of heavenly fire for bringing an uncalled for incense offering in the course of the dedication ceremonies of the Mishkan. This divine fire consumed them completely and left their father Aaron in a state of silence, torn between his emotions over the death of his sons and his pivotal role in the ceremonies taking place. The opening verse of this parsha recalls that event in introducing this other ceremony in which Aaron would also be the central participant. This particular ceremony is one of the most elaborately described in the Torah. It describes in great detail by Torah standards the various offerings and procedures to be done on Yom Kippur in biblical times. There are a few animal sacrifices and a very unique incense offering that involved the rare event of the high priest entering the inner sanctum of the Mishkan, the chamber which housed the Ark of the Covenant and nothing else. This ceremony takes up an entire chapter in the Torah. It seems to have little to do with Yom Kippur as we know it today. One of the more unique features of this ceremony is a procedure involving two goats. Lots were drawn, and one of the goats was selected to be an offering to Hashem, brought in the course of the day. The fate of the other was quite strange by any definition of the term. It was to be sent out into the wilderness, carrying the sins of the Israelites. This goat became known as the classic scapegoat, the thing that was chosen to bear the blame for the fault of others. Jewish tradition has it that this goat was led to a certain cliff in the vicinity of Jerusalem and cast off of it. It would break apart in the course of its fall, thus symbolizing the collective desire for all of the sins of the community to be eradicated. This goat has come to be identified as the classic biblical example of superstition. There doesn't seem to be any rhyme or reason for how it works. Can a goat really carry the sins of the Israelites off into the wilderness? How was anybody expected to believe that such a thing could actually take place in some real sense? But there it is. There is no question that the modern opinion of this, scientific or otherwise, would reject it out of hand as pure nonsense. But it was a highly significant biblical ceremony performed once a year and under the holiest of conditions. That we cannot relate to such a ceremony and consider it superstition is a reflection of vastly different times and beliefs. The Parsha has more of this. There is a prohibition against eating blood. While many are still disgusted by this, there are many who would deem this another antiquated example of superstition. Then there is the long list of prohibited incestuous relations. Although most of these are still considered repugnant and forbidden for quite rational reasons, there are some that are not. Among them are the prohibitions against sex with a menstruating woman and male homosexuality. Both of these are no longer universally considered taboo, and thus any belief prohibiting them is automatically placed in the dreaded category of superstition. But at the end of the Parsha, we find a general warning that seems to openly declare a superstitious slant. After the list of incestuous prohibitions is finished, we read, quote, "Do not let yourselves be defiled by any of these acts. It was as a result of them that the nations that I am driving away from before you became defiled. The land became defiled, and when I intervened against its sin, the land vomited out its inhabitants. And then a little later, you shall not induce the land to vomit you out by defiling it, as it vomited out the nation that was before you." This business about the land vomiting out its inhabitants is also found in next week's Parsha following the repetition of the prohibitions against incense. This odd expression is really a particularly graphic way of describing exile from the land. This, of course, implies that the land in some way cares about the sexual morality of its inhabitants. How are we to understand this? Are we expected to believe that the land has some sense of awareness as to what those who are living upon it are doing? This seems impossible even by the somewhat non-rational standards one might expect from the Bible. First off, we have to clarify that this is not understood as the land itself having some sort of volition to expel its inhabitants that it doesn't want. That would be an example of the classic idolatrous beliefs that are prohibited all over the Torah. The land is not a deity in any way, shape, or form. It was not worshipped in any manner by the Israelites. The universally understood explanation of this is that it was God who caused the land to vomit out its inhabitants if they committed these sins. While that might not take things out of the modern standard for superstition, it at least gets rid of any suspicion of idolatry regarding the land. But it's still pretty strange. Don't things like national exile happen because of wars or droughts or plagues? Those are perfectly rational explanations for this extreme situation that require no evoking of divine will or any form of the supernatural. Surely these sorts of things were known and very obvious in biblical times. The Bible mentions national exile several times, the most famous of which was that of the Israelites themselves. It came as a result of being conquered by an enemy nation. When described, there is no mention of the land vomiting out its inhabitants. So why is this imagery used here? The answer is that this was the Torah's way of describing such a thing. We may prefer to think of national exile as a very normal happening in the course of the events in the world. We may not wish to attribute any divine influence to such situations. We may think of it as simply a result of war or the whims of the weather or whatever. But we really don't know if there was not some supernatural will pulling the strings behind the scenes that set up that war or that drought. What makes droughts happen? What makes wars happen? There may be human influences and there may be atmospheric influences, but there also may be influences that do not work strictly along natural or what we might call rational means. Is attributing such a phenomenon to God really superstition? Or is it simply looking for a deeper reason to explain why things happen? We could even ask, who really is being superstitious? The one who evokes God to explain such things, or the one who refuses to consider anything divine in the picture? Shabbat Shalom.